In this video, the second in my series on how to write a 3D space shooter game in Unity, I'm going to teach you how to animate the cockpit flight controls, and we're also going to add a couple of Cinemachine virtual cameras so we can swap between our cockpit view and a follow camera view with smooth transitions. So let's jump right in and continue on our game development journey. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to animate these cockpit controls. So you see we got this wonderful joystick and throttle controls here, and I've already demonstrated in part one how you can go to these controls and you can rotate them. So you can see the joystick is rotating back and forth. You can rotate it that way. And I could do the same thing with the throttle controls. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick this cockpit interiors here. And I'm going to go into my scripts folder. And I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to call it, it's not really an animation, but it kind of is. I'll just say animation controls. And I'm going to create a new script. And I'm going to call this animate cockpit controls. And selecting our cockpit interiors. I'm going to drag this script on there, and we're going to open it up. So I know I'm going to want a few serialized fields, and I don't think I'm going to want start, but I am going to want an on update, I think. But first, let's just get rid of start, and let's add a serialized field. Oops. There we go, serialized field. And I want to transform for our joystick. And again, this is totally optional, but I'm going to add some Odin attributes just to kind of make this a little prettier in the inspector. I'm going to create a box group, and I'm going to call this flight control transforms. And I'm also going to add a float for how far the joystick can move. So I'll say and ranges. And I'm going to want this to be required. And I'll just go ahead and pull that up on this line and then put that down on the next line. I will copy this attribute. And let's add a vector 3, which is our joystick range. And we'll just default that to vector 3.0 to zero it all out. And let's create another field with that same attribute. And this is going to be a list of our throttles. So if you remember, if we go back to our go back to our editor, you can see that the throttle well, let's see, throttle control, you can see that it consists of two handles. So in the scene view, if I can get oriented correctly here, you can see that it's got two different handles that move independently. So what I'm going to do is in my script, I'm going to create a list of transforms, and I will call this throttles. And once again, we're going to have a range. So let's add that attribute, vector 3 throttle range. All right. Now we're also going to want to have access to our input control. Add a serialized field. Oops. Serialized field. Required. And I'm going to add the inline editor attribute. So this is another optional Odin attribute. And I want the mode to be boxed. And this is going to be a ship movement input. We'll call it movement input. And then we're going to want a private movement controls variable, or actually property. And it's going to be a expression body method that will return movement input dot movement controls. So essentially, this little script is going to use the same input that our ship uses to move to animate our control, our cockpit controls. So they're going to mirror the input that the ship is doing. So we're going to do all of this in onUpdate. So our joystick, local rotation, we're going to convert from Euler angles to a quaternion, because if you remember, Unity, the transform, uses a vector 3 for the rotation. So we're going to use the helper function quaternion.Euler, and we're going to pass in our x, y, and z coordinates for our Euler angles. So we're going to use the controller input dot pitch amount. We're going to multiply that by our joystick range. And so that pitch amount is going to be negative or positive depending on whether we're pitching down or up. And then we're going to multiply that by the range that we defined for how far the joystick can move up or down. And we'll do the same thing with the yaw amount. So the y-axis is going to be how much we're yawing. So that will be joystick range dot y. And then finally, we'll take the roll amount and we'll multiply that times joystick range dot z. Did y'all catch that? Dot x. Okay. Saying that local position is a vector 3. Oh, I want local rotation. Boy, I'm just not on top of my game today. All right. We'll see if that works, and then we'll come back and we'll do the throttle. So go back into the Unity editor and go back to the game view. Now let's look at our cockpit interior details here, and you can see that Odin is giving us some nice warnings here that we have not assigned these values. So our joystick, we're going to use the handle, and we're going to need to calculate what we want our range to be. And we can go ahead and add the throttle as well. There's one throttle. There's the second throttle. Okay, so those are good. Now, let's determine what the extents are that we want this to be able to move. So let's pick our joystick handle. And let's rotate it on the x-axis. So it looks like negative 35 is good for pitching back. Yeah, I think 35 is a good range. So pulling back, pull back 35, push forward 35. So what we'll do is we'll go down here, and on joystick range for X, we'll put 35. Okay, now let's look at it on the y-axis. It looks like 35 is a kind of a good go-to value for both axes there. Let's come up here and say 35. And then finally on the z-axis, what do you say, 35 all the way around? I'm not even sure I need to have a vector 3, but we'll go ahead and stick with that. Let's hit play and see what happens. Okay, I'm not seeing... Oh, you know what? Odin's giving us an error because we didn't assign our input. So we need to take our fighter's ship move. Oh, I also noticed that I did not save my prefab after I added this ship movement input. So let's go ahead and say apply all. And we're going to drag that onto our movement input over here. So let's take that, drag it there, hit play. So we're pitching up, we're pitching down, we're yawing left, we're yawing right. Now, one thing I notice is the roll jerks all the way to the X and Y location, or to the left and right location. And the reason for that is the way we implemented our desktop input controls. So we're using the vertical axis for the thrust. And then we're calculating the yaw and the pitch based on how far away from the center we are. So we're getting a fraction. But for roll, we're either giving it 1 or -1. So there's a couple of ways that we could fix that. I'll show you both ways. One is we can use what's called lerp to lerp between the current value and where we want this value to end up. And then another way would be able to use an axis on the input manager the same way we're using this vertical axis, because this is already going to give us a normalized value from -1 to 1. But we can kind of simulate that in here. So let's modify our roll amount in here. We're at a local variable, we'll call it roll. And then instead of returning this, we're going to say roll equals. And then we'll put this inside an else statement. And we'll say that roll equals that. So basically, we're saying we want our roll amount to be 1, -1, or 0, depending on whether or not we're pressing the Q key, the E key, or no keys. And then down here, we will set our roll amount. And we're going to have to add a variable for that. We're going to set that to, we're going to use this built-in mathf function called lerp. And we'll take our current roll amount as our starting point. We want to end up at roll. And then we're going to adjust that by time.delta time. And we want to adjust it by a step value. So let's just say 3. And let's create a field for that. And we will default that to 0. Let's go back into the Unity editor. And I have a syntax error because we are not returning our roll amount. All right, back into the Unity editor. That error should go away. We can hit play. And now when we roll, it should be a nice smooth roll. Instead of just jerking all the way over there left and right, we're getting that nice smooth interpolation. All right. Now the second way we could have done that is we could use the input manager. So if we go into project settings and we look at the input manager, you can see we've got all these different axes. And we're only making use of vertical right now. And you can see that vertical is mapped to the down arrow, the up arrow, and also the S key and the W key. But you can also specify this sensitivity value. And that's basically how much it's applying. So it's doing the lerping, basically the built-in interpolation that I just did. The input manager is doing that for us. And this is equivalent to what I put in my code where I multiplied it by 3. It does the same thing for gravity. Gravity is how quickly it will go back to neutral after you stop pressing the key. So all I could do if I wanted to handle it through the input manager is I could either add a new axis or I could rename one of the axes we don't use, like Fire 3 or Jump. I don't really know of any ship that jumps. I could rename one of those to Roll, and I could map it to the two keys that we're using, Q and E, and then I could set gravity to 3 and sensitivity to 3, and it would handle all of that for us. But that's how you would do it. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it the way we've done it since it's working. So you can now see both approaches there. Let's go ahead and animate our throttle. So we're going to want to go into our script. And we've already got our serialized fields here. So let's look at our update method and see what we need to add here. Let's say vector 3 throttle rotation. And we're just going to take the very first throttle that we got. And we're going to take its current local rotation. And we're going to convert it to Euler angles. So we're working with Euler angles. And then we're going to adjust that rotation on the x-axis. We're going to set it to control input dot thrust amount times our throttle range. And you know, throttle range, I don't think it needs to be a vector 3. I think because we're only ever, okay, so the joystick we rotated on 3 axes. We're only rotating the throttle on 1. So let's make this a float. And we'll default it to 35 since we know that that worked good for us. And now that we have this, we're going to iterate let's see. For each transform throttle in throttles throttle dot local rotation. We'll use our little helper quaternion.euler function, and we'll pass in our throttle rotation. There. So that will calculate what our throttle rotation should be, adjust it on the x-axis, iterate through each of our throttle transforms and set their local rotation to be that throttle rotation. Let's go back into the editor and hit play and see what happens. Oh, you see the throttle sticks moved? Oh, but only one of them moved. So I bet you I added the same handle twice. Or I only have one in there. Let me just make sure I'm adding the both. I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to lock that, grab these, and drag them into throttles. There we go. Unlock that, hit play. There we go. And if I throttle backwards, I think that looks really cool. All right, so that is animating our cockpit movement controls. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to want to add our virtual cameras. So right now our main camera is part of the escort fighter, and it's locked into position behind or inside the cockpit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and delete my escort fighter prefab, and I'm going to go into my prefabs. I'm going to open that prefab up, and I'm going to delete that camera. And I'm going to create a new empty game object here in our hierarchy, and I'm going to call this camera setup. I'm going to reset our transform to world origin, and then in here I'm going to create a new main camera, and I'm going to call that main camera, and I'm going to make sure it's tagged as main camera. Cool. And while I'm in here, I'm going to create a couple more tags. I'm going to add a tag called cockpit camera. And I'm going to add a tag called follow camera. Let me rename that. I don't want to have a space in it. Okay. All right, so our main camera is there. It's tagged main camera. It's got our audio listener. All of that looks good. So now we want to add Cinemachine virtual cameras. So, this is, by the way, we've broken our match rotation on our background camera because I had deleted and re-added the main camera. So let's go ahead and put that back there. And under our camera setup, let's add a virtual camera. So we'll go down to right-click, Cinemachine, virtual camera. And we'll just leave that called CMVCam1. And in our escort fighter, in our cockpit, let's create an empty game object. We're going to call that cockpit camera. And I'm actually going to move this camera into there. And I'm going to reset its position. I'm going to solo it. And we don't want it to do any of this stuff, which means we're going to say do nothing, because Because this one is, since it's a child of the cockpit, it's going to move and rotate with the ship. So we don't need to do any of the Cinemachine following, looking, and stuff like that. So we're going to take this and let's move it up. Let's say something like 0.5. And let's move it backwards. So we don't want to go... Oops. What is that that's clipping through there? Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I might take our field of view and increase it just a little bit. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we should have a virtual camera that's in our cockpit, and it's currently soloed. So that's the view we're going to have. If we go back to our main camera, you see it's added a Cinemachine brain. So we're going to use this to switch between different virtual cameras. So right now we have a cockpit camera. We're going to add a follow camera. But let's make sure that the cockpit camera still works. So we'll hit play. Oh, I forgot that we need to change our culling mask on this camera. We want this to be depth only, and we want to make sure that we don't render the background. Let's hit play. Okay, so our cockpit camera is still working. But we're no longer animating our cockpit controls. Oh, you know what? I think I did not save my prefab. I didn't override my prefab before I deleted it and then mucked around with the camera. So let's go back and look. What is this error, by the way? Animate cockpit controls. It wants our movement input. Let's go back here and override our prefab. Now let's see what happens. There we go. So we've got our cockpit camera working. We've got our animated cockpit controls all looking good. All right. So now let's add a follow camera. So under camera setup, let's right click here, Cinemachine virtual camera. And actually, let me create an empty game object. And I'm going to call that follow camera. I'm going to drag that into there. All right. Now this is going to be a little bit different. We want it to follow the fighter. We want it to look at the fighter. Okay, so that all looks pretty good. So let's see. I think those all look good. We're going to want to play with our positions a little bit. So let's go up above the fighter a tad. Let's go back. Oop, that's the aim. We don't want the aim. We want this to be adjusted. So let's go above the camera. Above the ship. We're already back about -10. Let's go back a little bit farther. Let's just say -20. And then I want to increase our yaw damping a little bit. So we're going to damp X, Y, and Z a little bit. I think that all looks good. So if we solo, we switch between the different cameras. You can see our different views there. And we can actually enable and disable these game objects. So I think that's pretty good for now. We're going to need to create a camera manager. So up here under managers, let's create a new empty game object and call this camera manager and go into our scripts folder. You know, while I'm in here, I'm going to change my view a little bit. I'm going to drag this hierarchy over here. I'm going to drag our project up under there. I'm going to shrink our console down a little bit. And I'm going to dock our scene view next to our game view. Just give me a little bit different perspective to work in. All right, so under our camera manager, go into our scripts folder, managers. I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call this camera manager. Select our camera manager game object and drag that camera manager script onto it. And open that up in the editor. All right. And we're going to want some serialized fields. Well, first of all, let me create an enumeration. I'm going to have a cockpit camera, and I want to make sure this matches the name of the tag I created. And follow camera. Okay, I think that's good. And I'm going to want a serialized field. It's going to be required. And I will call this box group virtual cameras. And the serialized field will be a list of game objects. Virtual cameras. And then in start, I will say set active camera. And I'm going to pass in cockpit camera. Virtual cameras dot cockpit camera. I will create a method called set active camera, and I want to move update up above that. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to iterate through my cameras. And if camera.tag.equals active camera.toString, then I want camera.setActive true. Actually, I can simplify this. I thought it would give me a nice way to refactor that. I think I can just say camera.setActive hides property. Really? All right, I'll rename it cam. Oh. I think that'll do it for us. So that should activate our virtual camera based on which one I pass in, cockpit or follow. And to test that, I'm going to go into our tutorial. I'm going to go into our hierarchy, and I'm going to, by default, disable the cockpit camera. So only our follow camera will be active until we start playing. And it did not pick the cockpit camera. Oh, you know why? If we go back to our camera manager, I have not added any virtual cameras. So let's add cockpit camera and follow camera. Hit play. It still did not choose that camera. Cockpit camera, follow camera. Did I tag them correctly? I did not. All right, let's try it now. There we go. We zoom into our cockpit. All right, so our camera manager will switch between the follow camera and the cockpit camera. So the next thing we want to do is in our camera manager, we want to be able to switch cameras by pressing different keys. So I'm going to have a function, or really it can be a property. Put it up here. I will call it camera key pressed. And I will say if, well, let's see. For int I equals 0, I is less than virtual cameras.count, increment I. If input.getKeyDown keycode.alpha1 plus I return, let's make this an enum. Return I plus, well, I cast as a virtual camera. So this one will be 0, and this one will be 1. Okay. Otherwise, return negative, well, we'll add no camera. Well, we'll just default. How about we just default to the cockpit camera? No, because I don't want to keep calling that set active. Well, it doesn't matter. I don't think it's going to affect performance that much. So in update, we will set active camera, camera key pressed. Let me just go back to doing this. So no camera. So if I'm not picking any camera, I should return that. And I'm going to do some debug log statements here. And go back into the editor. Keep an eye on the console. So we see a bunch of no cameras. I press 1. Cockpit camera, cockpit camera. Now hit 2. Oh, it's working now. I don't really like the way that looks, though. That's a very strange follow camera, to be sure. Gonna have to tweak those Cinemachine settings. So cockpit, follow. So it works, but it doesn't really look like I would expect a good follow camera to look. But I do like the transition between the cockpit and the follow. Let's take a look at our follow camera settings, our Cinemachine settings. And what are some things that we need to do to change? I think I want to change this to just be locked to target. Let's round that up to 2.5. That looks fine. I don't think we're doing any roll damping. I think we want to. We're not doing any pitch damping. Do I want to change anything under aim? Maybe go a little bit above. Anything else I want to change in here? Let's give this a try. Okay, so we're in the cockpit. I switch to follow. That looks better. Yeah, that's a pretty decent follow camera. Very cool. Switch back to the cockpit camera. I like it. Okay, so we've got our cockpit controls animated, and we have virtual cameras switching between the cockpit and a follow camera. Next, maybe I'll work on animating the engine, turning the thrusts on and off, adding a trail renderer, maybe particle system to it. And eventually we're going to have more virtual cameras. We're going to have a camera for like when the ship is destroyed, we'll switch out to give a good cinematic view of the ship being blown up. I think that'll look pretty cool. We may add some other cameras just for cinematic effects, cutscenes or something. But so that about wraps it up for this episode. If you found this useful, and I hope you did, please do me a favor and click that like and subscribe button. It really does help me to grow my channel. And if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, drop a chat down below and I'll do my best to respond to them as soon as I can. So thanks again for watching and good luck on your game development journey.